What if I told you that the company shaping what grows in your food once shaped what flowed into gas chambers? That one of the most powerful agricultural corporations on Earth today, a company that controls seeds, pesticides, and pharmaceuticals, has a lineage that runs straight through forced labor camps, chemical warfare, and some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history, origins and early history. Bayer is a name you've seen on aspirin boxes, crop chemicals, and pharmaceutical labels. But behind the clean branding and corporate press releases lies a story of power, protection, and repetition. A story where accountability fades, but influence survives. To understand Bayer today and why it now controls so much of the global food system, we have to go back to where it really began. Bayer was founded in 1863 in Germany, during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Its original focus was chemical dyes, coal tar-based compounds used in textiles. At the time, Germany was becoming the world's chemical powerhouse. Chemistry meant progress, medicine, industry, efficiency. But chemistry also meant something else: control. By the early 20th century, Bayer was no longer just a company. It was part of a rapidly consolidating industrial system, one that fused science, capital, and the state. That fusion reached its peak in 1925, when Bayer became a core member of a massive cartel called IG Farben. IG Farben wasn't just a company, it was the largest chemical conglomerate on Earth. It combined Bayer, BASF, Host, and several other firms into a single industrial machine. Together, they controlled dyes, synthetic fuels, explosives, pharmaceuticals, and chemical research at an unprecedented scale. And when the Nazi regime rose to power in the 1930s, IG Farben didn't resist. It aligned. IG Farben became essential to the German war economy. It supplied synthetic rubber and fuel when Germany was cut off from imports. It built factories next to concentration camps to exploit slave labor. One of those facilities, Auschwitz-Monowitz, was constructed specifically to serve IG Farben's industrial needs. Prisoners were worked to death producing chemicals, and the gas used in extermination camps, Zyklon B, was manufactured by a subsidiary connected to IG Farben's supply chain. This wasn't accidental involvement. It was industrial cooperation. Executives attended meetings, contracts were signed, profits were recorded. Chemistry had become weaponized, not just against enemy armies, but against entire populations. The aftermath of war. After World War II, the scale of these crimes was impossible to ignore. IG Farben was declared a criminal organization by the Allies. It was forcibly dismantled. On paper, justice had been served, but in reality, something else happened. Executives responsible for slave labor and chemical production received remarkably light sentences. Many were released early, some served only a few years, and then quietly they returned. The shattered pieces of IG Farben were reorganized into familiar names: Bayer, BASF, Host. Same expertise, same patents, same industrial knowledge, different logos. By the 1950s, Bayer was once again a respected multinational corporation, this time framed as a symbol of post-war recovery and modern science. Its past was treated as an unfortunate footnote. Its future was allowed to continue. Why this matters? This isn't about ancient history. It's about institutional continuity. When companies survive atrocities intact, when leadership is recycled rather than replaced, power doesn't disappear, it evolves. And Bayer would go on to evolve into something even more influential than before. Not just a chemical company, but a gatekeeper of health, and eventually, of food itself. Mid-century expansion and global controversies. By the 1950s and 60s, Bayer had successfully rebranded itself. The war was over, Germany was rebuilding, and Bayer positioned itself as a symbol of modern science, medicine, and innovation. The company expanded aggressively into three core areas: pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals, agricultural chemicals. This period is critical, because it's when Bayer stopped being just a chemical producer and started becoming a global systems company, embedded in healthcare, farming, and state supply chains across continents. Pharmaceutical power. Bayer leaned heavily into medicine. Aspirin became a global household name. Prescription drugs followed. Hospitals, governments, and aid organizations became long-term customers. This gave Bayer something incredibly valuable: trust. When a company supplies medicine, it gains moral authority by default. People assume it exists to heal. But behind the branding, the logic remained industrial: maximize output, protect patents, expand markets. And that logic would lead directly into one of the most disturbing scandals in modern pharmaceutical history: the AIDS-tainted blood scandal. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bayer, through its pharmaceutical divisions, was producing blood-clotting products used by hemophiliacs. At the time, these products were made from pooled human plasma. When HIV emerged, it became clear that these blood products could transmit the virus. The United States and several other countries banned or restricted untreated blood products once the danger was recognized. But Bayer didn't destroy all of its stock. Instead, blood products that could no longer be sold in the U.S. were exported to developing countries, particularly in Africa and parts of Asia. Countries with weaker regulatory systems, countries dependent on foreign medical supplies. Thousands were infected. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't a lack of information. Internal awareness existed. The products were simply redirected. For the victims, the consequences were irreversible. For Bayer, the legal consequences were limited. Settlements were paid, statements were issued, and the company moved on. Once again, the pattern repeated: profit first, accountability later, if ever. Chemicals, war, and authoritarian states. While pharmaceuticals built Bayer's public image, chemicals remained its backbone. During the Cold War, Bayer and related German chemical firms supplied materials across the globe, often to regimes where ethics were not a priority. One of the most notorious examples emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, when German chemical companies, including entities tied historically to IG Farben's successor firms, were implicated in supplying precursor chemicals used in Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons program. These weapons were used against Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Kurdish civilians in northern Iraq, entire villages were wiped out with chemical gas. Once again, the defense was technical. We supplied chemicals, not weapons. But history shows that industrial chemistry doesn't exist in a vacuum. When suppliers know how products will be used and continue supplying anyway, that neutrality collapses. Bayer, like many large chemical firms, benefited from the distance between production and consequence. The harm happened far away. The profits came home. Shift toward agriculture. By the late 20th century, Bayer began shifting strategic focus. Pharmaceuticals were heavily regulated. Public scrutiny was growing. But agriculture offered something different. Farming needed chemicals. Farming needed seeds. And farmers were becoming dependent on industrial inputs to survive: herbicides, pesticides, crop treatments. Bayer invested heavily. Agriculture was stable, predictable, and scalable. This is where Bayer's chemical heritage found its most powerful modern application, not in medicine, but in food production. And it set the stage for the single most controversial acquisition in the company's history. Because if Bayer was the architect of chemical systems, Monsanto was the enforcer. Monsanto, acquisition, control, and the modern food monopoly. To understand why Bayer process turret, why Bayer's acquisition of Monsanto matters, you first have to understand what Monsanto actually was. Monsanto wasn't just a company. It was a business model. Founded in the United States in the early 20th century, Monsanto evolved into the most aggressive agricultural corporation on the planet. Its strategy was simple and brutally effective. Control the seeds, control the chemicals, control the farmer. Monsanto pioneered genetically modified crops designed to work with its own herbicides, most famously Roundup, based on glyphosate. The pitch sounded harmless, even helpful. Higher yields, easier weed control, lower labor costs. But the reality was dependency. Farmers were required to buy new seeds every season. Saving seeds, something humans had done for thousands of years, was turned into a crime, enforced by contracts and lawsuits. Fields contaminated by neighboring farms' GM pollen led to legal battles between farmers who never agreed to use Monsanto products in the first place. Neighbors fought neighbors. Communities fractured. Small farmers lost cases they couldn't afford to fight. Monsanto didn't just sell products, it policed agriculture. And this reputation followed it everywhere. By the 2010s, Monsanto had become one of the most hated corporations on Earth, synonymous with environmental damage, legal intimidation, and corporate overreach, which is exactly when Bayer stepped in. The acquisition. In 2018, Bayer acquired Monsanto for roughly $63 billion. This wasn't a merger of equals, it was a strategic absorption. Bayer inherited Monsanto's genetically modified seed portfolio, its pesticide empire, its intellectual property, and its legal liabilities. Suddenly, one corporation controlled seeds, herbicides, pesticides, crop data, agricultural research, from lab to soil to harvest. Bayer officially dropped the Monsanto name, but not its practices. The branding disappeared, the system remained. Why this is a monopoly problem? When one company controls both the input and the solution, competition collapses. Farmers can't simply choose another option when local seed diversity has vanished. Alternatives are priced out. Supply chains are consolidated. This is not free market agriculture. It's managed dependency. Bayer now sits at the center of a global agricultural web, where decisions made in corporate boardrooms affect what farmers plant, what chemicals are sprayed, and what ends up on plates across the world. And the pattern is familiar. From IG Farben, to Cold War chemical exports, to pharmaceutical scandals, to agricultural domination. Different decades. Same logic. Scale first, responsibility later. Why this story matters. Bayer's story isn't just about one company. It's about how power survives history, how corporations can outlive crimes, scandals, and public outrage, not by changing what they do, but by changing how they are seen. When chemistry becomes profit, when food becomes intellectual property, when survival becomes a subscription, we stop talking about innovation and start talking about control. This channel exists to unpack stories like this, slowly, carefully, with context. If you want more deep dives into corporate power, hidden histories, and the systems shaping your everyday life, subscribe, support the channel, help it grow.